Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody, both in the room and everywhere else around the world. We at APNIC would like to congratulate the Internet Society on their 25th anniversary for their leadership in the internet-related standards, in access, in policy, in education. We're very happy to collaborate with ISOC in providing, the venue and the facilities for this intercommunity node. We warmly welcome you, and we look forward to your enthusiastic participation today in the discussion and in the celebration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Now, let me just explain a couple of things. Firstly, we are going to also have a report from the Pacific Islands chapter, so we'll do that in a moment. But just to explain the situation in Australia, we call ourselves Internet Australia rather than ISOC AU. That's a decision we made about 3 years ago as we tried to step up and become very active in the debate about probably the most important issue, if you accept the principle that the internet is for everybody, and that is our somewhat trouble-plagued national broadband network. We have a government organisation building a broadband network, and in a short time I'll ask one of my co-directors, Dr. Paul Brooks, to discuss some of the technical aspects of that. But essentially, we also adopted a slogan which is helping shape our internet future. And so for the last 3 years, we've become quite high profile in our advocacy for a better broadband network, but also we've looked at the issues that other people have been talking about, how the internet affects our lives. We've been talking about the digital divide, and I've got one of my colleagues here, Emma Dawson, who is going to be talking about the digital divide. And look, if we have time, we will also invite some of the other people here in the room to ask questions. But to begin with, I'm going to throw to Kasak Gargal, who's going to give us a report on the Pacific Islands.
Thanks, Laurie. Kasak Gargal from Papua New Guinea. Yes, so when I was asked by ISOC to be on this in this discussion at this panel, I just started a thread on the Pacific Island chapter's mailing list, and which drew a lot of attention and started a healthy discussion, and probably indicates the importance of this topic within the Pacific Islands. Now, regarding rights and freedoms on the internet, I guess in the islands, it has a different sort of meaning, I guess, because in not only in the islands but perhaps in other regions which access and connectivity are an issue, these topics certainly dominate the discussion whenever anything internet is and internet related is discussed. So when the issue of rights and freedoms on the internet came about, it sort of diverted back to that, and people started talking about right as access as a right and not just as a luxury, as we find in the Pacific Islands. Many who are able to afford the high cost of internet are the ones who get connected, and that further creates a greater digital divide. So that was one of the things that came about, was to consider the access and connectivity as a right, and which led to another discussion why it should be considered a right, and why is it important. And that discussion went along in saying that the right to access, it allows others to participate in a medium that large population of the planet are participating in, and and it allows them to exercise their rights. So, in order to the next step, as people get more connected to the internet, is how do you protect their rights? How do they their freedoms on the internet? And that's very important. And one of the main things that came about was that the people who are now being connected to the internet, they need to be able to know how to use it, how to exercise their rights on the internet. So digital literacy was the main thing that came out of that discussion that should be, and active inclusion. Two main points that came out of the discussion was in the islands, digital literacy of the general population of internet users, as well as active inclusion of vulnerable groups and others who may not be able to readily be able to participate. Should be the main the concentration, people who concentrate on that, apart from just providing access and then opening up a whole new doors of exposure to threats that can violate their rights and freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie. It's interesting, last year we nominated the year as the National Year of Digital Inclusion, and had exactly the same sorts of discussions about how you make sure that if people have access to the internet, they know how to use it and they're aware of the risks as well as the benefits. So we'll probably come back to that in a little while. The next speaker is Dr. Paul Brooks. Many of you will know Paul. He's a world-renowned expert on the internet, and we're very, very fortunate that we have him to drive a lot of our policy work. We appear before parliamentary inquiries from time to time, and at one we decided that we wanted to make sure that they understood that we were significant, and I made the point that at some stage someone on the panel was going to throw their hands in the air and say, surely this is not rocket science, to which I replied, it is rocket science, that's why we brought a rocket scientist. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Paul Brooks, who is the Vice Chair of Internet Australia, or ISOC AU.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, Paul Brooks, the Vice Chair for Internet Australia. Now, I've been involved with Internet Australia since the chapter was first chartered. I think one of the first 6 chapters to be chartered globally. We've had our own anniversaries and things along the time. I was very fortunate to be in Geneva for the 20th anniversary celebrations, and consider myself very fortunate to be here again 5 years later, looking at the 21st anniversary for the Internet Society globally. It's a very important organisation here in Australia and around the world in terms of the leadership on a technical basis and its housing of the IETF, providing what is much needed in Australia, a politically neutral, technology-focused, almost scientific approach, along with a very pragmatic approach of rough consensus and running code in terms of making sure that this huge global beast that we call the internet continues to function, continues to grow, continues to thrive, effectively directed by lots of small and large organisations all around the world, coordinated through the principles without necessarily the explicit direction of figureheads, and that's very important on a global basis. In terms of surveillance and personal freedoms and things, one of the things we've been doing in Australia, and one of the things that has been cropped up over recent years, are common themes all around the world in many countries, government mandated forms of data collection, mandatory laws for telecommunications carriers and ISPs and service providers to retain data about people's internet activities and even telephone activities unrelated to the internet. And in Australia, we have recently had brought in a much more, the government would call it robust, version of mandatory data retention, where all service providers, all carriers are required to hold information about any organisation or any citizen's online activities and telephone calls, metadata about the communications for a period of 2 years, and to retain even information like changes of street address, changes of name by detail, changes in customer information, all need to be recorded and stored by service providers for a period of 2 years. Now, ostensibly, this was to help the authorities backtrack information for things that might have been occurring months or years ago, to try to catch what was targeted at the time, terrorism activities. What we found in the intervening period is that much of the request for that information from the authorities is actually not necessarily about terrorism, or at least the ones that we know about and hear about are not about terrorism, but more about other forms of criminal activities. Now, the important thing to understand here, which is different from other countries, in the UK in particular, I believe, is that here it's all about the description of the online activities, but not the content of the activities itself. So the government still does not have any rights to access Australians' web browsing history or where they've gone and what they've done online, but it's more about, in particular, when they connected, when they disconnected, but in particular location, where they were when they connected, which is a two-edged sword. And one of the things that we focus on when advising government is that this surveillance, while they put forward the positive case that it can be used for solving crimes, potentially for finding people that are lost and put an emergency call and they don't know where they are, and then the authorities can triangulate and rescue them in the bush or in a remote setting. It's a two-edged sword. It's a tool like any other tool, like an axe. It can be used for good, it can be used for evil. In Australia, I think our government is not as prone, I guess, than governments in many other countries to use the information they have collected, as far as we understand, to suppress activities that should be permitted and should be allowable, as in dissent and freedoms for, sorry, word's gone. But other countries certainly are. And to the extent that other countries use the Australian environment, which is modelled very extensively on the UK environment, to bring in their own legislation, where what they do with that data may be more nefarious than the government here, that's obviously a concern for us and I believe for the internet society globally. We're looking at that. Now, the fact that some of that information is collected may cause people to moderate and effectively self-censor and self-moderate the activities they do online. Separately, we've also in Australia had other laws that may have a much more explicit and much more active effect on people's use of the internet, being essentially explicit website blocking and mandatory content filtering, which is being used at the moment for mainly blocking access to sites that allegedly facilitate copyright infringement. Now, most of the sites that have been used, there's a court order involved, so it's public knowledge which sites are targeted, but there is now a process in Australia where the content industry can put up sites that they consider to be infringing copyright, and the government can then mandate that all ISPs must block access to those sites. The issue that we had when we first were addressing this with government is not so much the copyright aspect of it, but the risk of collateral damage. And this is something that's explored in other countries around the world, that if the blocking is not done right, or is done in a ham-fisted way, then the risk of collateral damage of blocking perfectly legal content, of blocking perfectly accessible content, is as high as the possible benefits of blocking access to the copyright material. So we have both implicit and explicit affecting of how people use the internet here in Australia, and those flow into similar concepts around the world. In terms of one of the questions we're talking about, in terms of whether it's even possible now to unplug and be disconnected from the internet so that your activities aren't monitored, your activities aren't stored and can't be used in that sort of pervasive surveillance. We, as most other countries are around the world, are moving to a stage where just acting in civil society is extremely difficult because the governments themselves, in terms of saving costs, are increasingly moving more and more of their services online. It's becoming very, very difficult for the ordinary citizen to be able to transact with normal, everyday government services and commercial services without doing it in some form of online way, whether you like it or not. So from a privacy perspective, we now find ourselves in a situation here, as I would expect many places do around the world, that the activities are almost forced online, whether you like it or not, are then tracked online, whether you like it or not. And that is as important as many of the, I guess, anti-privacy advocates who claim that it doesn't really matter because people give away far more of their private details on Facebook, on a lot of social media, than the government actually collects in a background way. But of course, that is effectively a choice. If you want to be using the services, if the product is free, then you're the product. But the concern is that information flow then needs to be protected so that commercial services, as well as government sources, can't misuse the data for their own purposes.
Thank you, Paul. When I joined Internet Australia 3 years ago, one of the things that really attracted me to the organisation was the fact that we are part of a global organisation. And I think that the comments Paul's making reflect the fact that whatever happens in one country is being often looked at and possibly used as the basis for what other countries might do. And so in the case of site blocking for the purposes of dealing with piracy, we have a big debate going here because there's really very little evidence that Hollywood is losing a lot of money here. They'll say otherwise, of course. But I think there's a case to be argued that they've been trying to use us and other jurisdictions to bring in regulations that they can then take to the rest of the world. So I think there's a really huge role for the Internet Society to play to make sure that everybody understands what everybody else is going through and the experiences that they have, because we're not alone. I think the other thing that comes through from Paul's comments, the Internet is only as good as the trust that people have in the Internet. And some of the issues to do with privacy and the Data Retention Act, while they have serious technical implications, as Paul highlighted, they also have the impact on people's trust of the Internet. And if we lose trust in the Internet, then that really will impact on the way people lead their lives. And that brings us also to the question of how people do use the Internet. And increasingly, as Paul reflected, the Australian government, like a lot of governments, is now trying to get as much of the activity with taxpayers and the community online, which means that if you are not connected, if you don't have access to the Internet, or you don't have the skills to use the Internet, then you can very easily and very quickly get stuck in a digital divide. So the next speaker is my friend Emma Dawson, who has experience in both government and in the private sector, and is currently the Executive Director of Per Capita, which is a progressive think tank. Emma was involved in the setting up of what is now an annual Digital Inclusion Index. And so I've asked Emma to talk about the Digital Inclusion Index and how that goes about highlighting the digital divide and what we might do about it.
Thanks, Laurie. So the Australia's Digital Inclusion Index was launched just over a year ago, with the second index came out this year. It's a collaboration between Telstra, our largest telecommunications carrier, and the Centre for Social Research, which was at Swinburne University, is now RMIT and other of our tertiary research institutions. As Laurie alluded to, the issue of the digital divide in Australia, like everywhere, is becoming increasingly pressing as more and more of our civic and social activities move online. A report by Deloitte Access Economics, which is one of our larger corporate research and economic advisory firms in Australia, found about 18 months ago, calculated that the savings to the federal government of moving most of their service delivery online was in the range of around $8 billion over the forward estimates, which is the 4-year forward budget projection. So it's a significant saving to government if they can move things like provision of healthcare services, information and advice about healthcare, social security inquiries and so on, tax affairs, to online rather than having call centres and face-to-face operations. And the government's certainly moving very strongly in that direction. So the research that was done for the Digital Inclusion Index found that Australia's digital divide has narrowed significantly over the last decade, but at the same time it has deepened, so that those people that do find themselves unable to fully participate online are significantly more disadvantaged by that than they were a decade ago. And we found, unsurprisingly, that the digital divide was concentrated amongst various demographic groups. Older Australians, people over 65, those that live in regional and rural Australia, people from low-income backgrounds, those with a disability, and our Indigenous people. The one group that's usually found in social science surveys that usually share characteristics with those groups are Australians from non-English speaking backgrounds. They are not overly represented in our digital divide in Australia. In fact, people from non-English speaking backgrounds in Australia tend to be more connected online than their English speaking counterparts. And the obvious reason for that is that they're accessing content from their home countries via the internet. However, those groups that I mentioned that are part of the digital divide are also overrepresented in the client base for government services in terms of provision of pension, healthcare and other social security assistance. So there is a very real and pressing problem for the government if they're seeking to move service delivery online and finding that a majority of their client base are amongst those that are least able to access those services. In terms of why these particular demographic groups are finding it difficult to access the internet in a relatively wealthy, sixth wealthiest country in the world, like Australia, there are various reasons, none of which will surprise anyone involved in the Internet Society. Access is about various factors. Infrastructure is a big problem in regional and rural Australia, so the provision of reliable internet services and just physical access to those in parts of regional and rural Australia is a big part of the problem. For older people and for those on low income, from a low income, cost is a big part of the problem. Australians notoriously have some of the highest mobile phone usage rates in the world, but a lot of people from those more disadvantaged backgrounds don't use a lot of data on their mobiles because of the cost here. As you may be aware, Australia has a particularly quirky system of charging for data, a little differently to the rest of the world. And as Kesha referred to, literacy, digital literacy is a big problem in those groups as well, particularly for older Australians, people with disabilities and people from an Indigenous background. And to bring it full circle back to the topic of security, particularly for older Australians, there's a lack of trust in the security of the internet, so they're very loath to put their to do any online banking, for example, or to interact with government services because they feel unsure that their personal information is being held securely. And just to finish up, I would note that our regulatory regime in Australia has largely failed to keep up with these issues. So one of the problems that we do have in terms of closing the digital divide is, for example, the universal service obligation, which is the requirement on our major carriers to ensure that everybody has reasonable access to communication services, still only applies to landline telephones and has not yet been extended to cover internet services, and that's something that many of us have been lobbying for that change for some time. Similarly, subsidies for people from low-income backgrounds or those on pensions to specifically access home-based, broadband-based internet are not as yet part of the mix, or certainly not as much as they need to be in order to address these issues.
Thank you, Emma. I thought I might just come back to the other end of the table and see if Kasich has anything he wanted to add, although he probably doesn't have a microphone. Has the microphone? I'm just interested in where you see the Pacific Islands going in the future in terms of all the sort of issues that we're talking about. Are you suffering the same constraints as we are, or do you have different issues?
Well, the internet still has a lot of room to grow in the Pacific. For example, in my country of Papua New Guinea, connectivity is still below 20%. So there is still a lot of room to grow. Which would also mean that there is a lot of potential for carriers, entrepreneurs, that to also grow within that space. And also, an important thing is the the policy development, and it needs to be more inclusive. And main decision makers need to, well, the ones who are who have had the opportunity to, well, speaking about the general population, the ones who have had the opportunity to be exposed to the internet and have that level of digital literacy should be contributing more to the development of the policy within the country and the region. And also, I guess it's a bit of a legacy of the old telecommunication infrastructure that and how it is governed, which a lot of the legacy of that still exists in terms of internet policy and regulation within the Pacific Islands. So I think at this point in time, it's been hard to guess. I'll give an example. In last year, there was a Papua New Guinea, the Parliament passed a cybersecurity policy, which later came under a lot of fire from the, I guess, the empowered community who looked through it and said, hey, hang on, this has a lot to do with the content that you're putting on the internet rather than the actual security and the stability of the infrastructure. So it came under a lot of fire, people questioning whether it was just a weak policy just to maintain a bit of, or to get a bit of censorship under the guise of cybersecurity. So that's one of the areas that could be, has a lot of room to improve on. Thanks.
Thank you. I guess we all know the benefits of the internet. We're all, I think, pretty much signed up. But the question really is, what will the internet be like in, say, 5 years from now? And I'd like to pose that question to each of the panel, but I'm also going in a moment to open it up to some of the other guests in the room. So, Paul, first of all, how do you see the internet in Australia unfolding over the next 5 to 10 years? What are going to be the key issues?
Look, there's a number of things on the technology side and on the policy side, on the content side. But from a user perspective, as a home user, as a business user, I think the internet is going to look much the same as it does now. The underlying infrastructure will change. The capacity, the bandwidth that everybody will use will be greater. We're still seeing the 40%, 30%, 40%, in some countries 60 to 70% year-on-year growth of traffic and demand as applications move in, particularly in some countries. I'm doing a lot of work at the moment in Indonesia, in a country with very low internet penetration, huge programs for building out mobile networks and mobile infrastructure, mobile towers going up by the thousands all over the place, starting from a relatively low base. But the growth of the internet and usage in those countries will be even larger than it is in Australia today. From a usability perspective, one of the things that concerns me, that is one of the aspects that the Internet Society has been driving globally recently, is the promotion of pervasive encryption. Sorry, I can't see. The drive and the promotion of pervasive encryption as a means of ensuring safety and privacy of end-user communications is something that I'd certainly like to see be driven more. It's one of those things where, you know, even going back 10, 15 years, email standards have had encryption, digital signatures, as part of something that's been built-in standard. The clients all support it, the software all supported it for the last 20 years. But it's very, very little used. The question is why, and what we can do in the Internet Society here in Australia and globally to promote, to the users as opposed to the government practical and easy to understand ways for the use of those sort of facilities in a way that promotes the privacy and safety of communications. As Laurie, as you said, the use of the internet, the good use of the internet, the growth of the internet for transacting so many aspects of everyday life revolves around trust. You won't use a system if you don't trust it to keep your data safe. And in a world where so much more of our data and activities are being tracked and logged, we know they're being tracked and logged. It's explicitly legal to be tracked and logged. It's not, they're not trying to do it surreptitiously. Then it's up to us to help and educate the end users on how to use the environment safely, or how to set up their systems so that their use is implicitly safe without them necessarily having to think about it, because you don't want the internet to just be safe for the technically capable and the highly informed who can set about setting up their own system to be like that. You really want it to be like that by default for everybody. So for me, over the next 5 years, it's about education of users, less than education of government, around how to set their systems up to secure by default, encrypt by default, all forms of activity. Web-based activity, ironically, is actually relatively safe now. So many sites implement HTTPS, secure HTTP, TLS, encrypted web sessions. It's very rare to see a web session or a web page use which is not yet encrypted. But other forms of communication, such as email, ironically one of the oldest forms of communication and methods and applications on the internet, is still very rarely encrypted. And that's, I think, something that we could be working on over the next 5 years.
I'm guessing that we're having a problem with the microphone, so I'm not sure which microphone I'm using here now.
This one's fine.
So look, if anyone hasn't guessed, I used to be a journalist, and so I'm trained to ask the questions that nobody wants asked. So I'm going to ask one, and I say this with great affection, and it's this. So we could hardly have expected the amazingly creative, forward-thinking and technically geniuses who invented the internet to have possibly foreseen some of the problems that would turn up over the next 25 years. Is it impossible to solve those problems? Are we destined to be plagued by all of the things that we're concerned about now, whether it's the dark web, whether it's spam, whether it's trolling, whatever it is there no way to fix that? I'm not going to ask Emma that question. I'm going to throw that one out just for the moment. Anyone in this group here wants to think about. But I'm going to ask Emma what she thinks we should see in the next 5 years, given that Emma has spent a considerable amount of time in government policy.
Thanks, Laurie. I think the next 5 years and 5 to 10 years will be interesting in Australia in terms of how the public, the consumer, starts to react once the national broadband network is completed and once the consumer understands what it is that they're getting in terms of connectivity and how that feeds their use. So since Netflix launched in Australia a couple of years ago, our demand for bandwidth has gone up considerably, and that's only expected to continue. I think we will see real pressure brought to bear on internet service providers to bring costs down, and the challenge of that, of course, is that the pricing model for the national broadband network will make that extremely challenging. I think that we'll see a growing awareness amongst Australian internet users that they are being charged for bandwidth in a way that comparable users in other comparable jurisdictions are not, and that we'll start to see a significant backlash against that, and there will be quite a deal of pressure on government to change the regulatory and price settings for the wholesale network to address some of those issues, because I don't think the industry shows any indication of coming together to solve that issue itself. So I think that will go back on government. to address. I also think there'll be, and I hope we will see, a recognition by government that there are certain sectors that I alluded to before in society that will need practical and financial support to be able to fully adopt the internet as a mode of commerce and of service delivery, and that if the government wants to achieve its aims of moving its service delivery online, then it will have to invest in some kind of assistance package to get that last sort of 10 to 15% of very resistant users over the line. In terms of issues to do with trust and security, as Paul alluded to, I actually think we'll see that, and this is purely based on my perception of the debate and anecdotal evidence and what I see occurring in social media. Well, I think that there will remain a core group of people very concerned about those issues, and rightly so. I think the research evidence is that it's very much a generational divide, and that younger people are a lot less concerned about the security of their information. They're a lot more open about their lives and putting those lives online. There is a school of thought that says as those people grow older, they'll become less open in the way they interact online. I don't think we know that is the case. I think we're dealing with the first generation of genuine digital natives, and how their perception or use of the internet will change over time, we don't really know, because we don't have a roadmap of people that have grown up using that technology in the same way. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'm noticing on the screen here there's a fair lag, so I have to tell you that I'm jumping up and down, and I've got a microphone in my hand, and that this may not translate to a lot of countries, but when I do this at conferences, I describe this as my Graham Norton impersonation. So if you don't know of Graham Norton, just think of somebody rushing around in a studio with a microphone, which is what I'm doing now, because I'm going to try and invite some of the people in the group here to express any opinion they like, or on any subject. This is a free-for-all. But please introduce yourself and then go for it.
Thanks very much, Laurie. This is Duncan McIntosh. I work for the APNIC Foundation, which supports the development program of APNIC, which for those watching and listening is the Internet Numbers Registry for the Asia-Pacific region, serving the 56 economies of the region. APNIC is obviously based here in Brisbane, but we work right across the region in providing number resources. And the role of the foundation is really to support the development program of APNIC and providing training, technical assistance, community development work around the region. And I think one thing I would flag in this discussion, and Paul's touched on it and Kasek's touched on it already, is that the discussion we're having is obviously based on the recognition, understandably, that everybody is connected and has the option of not connecting or participating or discussing these issues. Whereas the situation in our region is there's still a very large number of people and community who aren't connected. So we still have a long way to go in the Asia Pacific in ensuring that everyone can participate in these sort of discussions and has the option to either retreat or stay connected. And I think it's important to flag and recognise that, and recognise that as these communities become connected, a lot of them move to embrace particular services and communities in very large numbers. I think of Myanmar, for example, and the use of Facebook there, and the impact that has on those communities. The other thing that I would sort of flag to the community is in having these discussions, we would always hope that they wouldn't impact on the role of the use and the deployment of really important infrastructure that helps these communities connect in fast and efficient ways. A particular example would be internet exchange points, which are flourishing around the region, and those of you familiar with IXPs play a really important role in keeping traffic local, in ensuring that the community they serve can access fast and efficient and reasonably priced. But obviously IXPs can be very challenging for many communities which debate the pros and cons backwards and forwards. But from our point of view, we would always hope that communities could focus on the benefits of open and neutral IXPs in serving communities. And those pieces of infrastructure are really fundamental in providing the connectivity that allows us to have this discussion that we're having today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other people here who want to say something? We must. We've got a very quiet room. And we haven't had any questions. Have we had any questions from the globe? We haven't. Very quiet. I'm not sure what time it is in the rest of the world, but it's afternoon here. So, all right. Okay. So let's just go back to what the Internet Society can do for us. And I'm going to ask Paul, hasn't been given this question on notice, but Paul, having been involved with the Internet Society for a long time, how do you see the Internet Society developing over the next 25 years?
That's actually a really interesting one. One of the challenges that I know is not unique to Australia, that most other chapters have around the world, is that the people that are running the organisation, that are doing a lot of the organising, doing a lot of the sleeves rolled up activities, are volunteers. It's true in Australia as it is around the world. We all have day jobs. And that sometimes takes our time away from important things like the Internet Society. One of the challenges, and also I guess one of the opportunities that is being addressed in recent years, is some of the communications tools and the chapter delegates list and the various forums that have sprung up just in the last couple of years that enable the chapter leadership to see a lot more of what is happening in other chapters, get a lot more visibility about what other chapters are facing, how they're solving the problems in their own systems, and an opportunity for us and other chapters to contribute to that discussion in other countries. And in a sense, using the term is eating our own dog food, but using the internet much more effectively so that ISOC global. In Australia, ISOC global is a very, very long way away. No matter where you are, time zones are an issue which are not going to go away. So tools that can help foster that discussion, that can recognise that time zones are a reality and ensure that discussions continue for several days, so that people from all time zones have an opportunity to chime in. And it's also been heartwarming to see some of the discussions over the last couple of years about funding. Funding is always a problem, and many chapters exist on almost no funding at all, on the odd local grants. In Australia, we have membership fees which help support us and provide some money for travelling. We have a very, very big country to travel around. It typically requires airfares rather than driving. So there are some realities in some chapters, more or less than others, in terms of the amount of funding that's required and where that funding can come from to enable the volunteers that make up the Internet Society leadership to effectively engage with members within the country or within the city, and engage with policymakers and the important folks who actually have the power to make the decisions that we can advise them on the pros and cons to make sure that we have the facilities and the ability to be in their ear, in their face if we need to be, and to engage in an effective way. And that is a challenge for us as it is for many other chapters, and a challenge for the global ISOC organisation, as has been discussed on the chapters list over the last few years, to work out how to effectively and efficiently disperse funds from the hub to the spokes, so that we can effectively carry out the mission of the Internet Society, and do that in a way that's customised to the local conditions and the local flavours and the local cultures that enable the Internet Society at a very local grassroots level to do its job effectively.
Thank you. It's been said that you should never, ever give me a fair chance because I'll take it. And so I'm just going to echo what Paul has said and just talk for a moment about my experience of running Internet Australia, or ISOC AU, for the last 3 years. I was given two main KPIs. One was to make people stand up and notice us and to take us seriously as a neutral expert group able to contribute to policy. And the other thing I was asked to do was to see if I could raise more money. And we've been spectacularly successful in the first and a complete failure in the second. And there are a number of reasons for that, and I'm wondering, and again, this is a question that I put to the global organisation, not necessarily to be answered now, but it does seem to me that we are in the unique position of everybody loves us, but nobody wants to own us. And when I've tried to get organisations, corporations to contribute, I'm constantly told, well, we're already giving to somebody else. And so I just wonder where we go in the next 5 years. And I think for ISOC AU, it will be back to a largely volunteer organisation, because I just don't think there's an appetite in the community for people to fund an organisation that does good works on their behalf when it's actually doing it anyway. So I think that sort of brings me to a really important question in terms of the future, the next 25 years of the Internet Society. I've been able to travel to Bangkok for a chapters meeting, and I know some of the other chapters have the same issues. So my plea would be to see if we can't have another look at the business model and see whether there's an opportunity to bring some of the money further down the chain to those of us who are on the ground, because I think we would get an exponential benefit from that. Having said that, I'm probably surprising if my microphone's still working, but there you go. I know Joyce will take it in good stead. I'm going to do a quick whip around the room because we're fast running out of time, but I want to ask everybody in the room, because I want everyone to have had an opportunity to contribute. Can people effectively unplug from the internet, or are we actually all going to be forced to be digital citizens? And just please tell me who you are, where you're from, and what you say, yes or no.
This is George from APNIC. I think it's getting increasingly hard to completely unplug. I think engaging in society is now assumed to use internet technologies more than not. I'm not convinced this is a good thing, but I think it's the emerging reality.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Chiu, also from APNIC. I think I cannot live without internet anymore, even for a few hours when I was on the plane, and I want Wi-Fi internet on the plane also.
I used to hate the idea of Wi-Fi on a plane, but I know what you mean. It's very difficult once you get used to it.
Louise from APNIC. I agree with George. I think there's no escaping it. My concern is the delivery of services to people who are not connected.
Yes, Duncan from APNIC Foundation. Yes, I think we'll add a third one to death, taxes, and the internet. You won't be able to avoid any of the three.
You could, but I guess so to be around to your own detriment, I guess, looking at how hard it is to engage without the internet.
George from APNIC, I also agree with George's point. It's becoming harder and harder to disconnect. I think people craving information all the time and having devices that allow us to access it so easily.
I'm Jake from APNIC. It's already convenient enough to do things online, so that'll just catapult every business to prefer that over other ways of serving their customers, I think.
Hi, it's Serge from SysTech. It's inevitable, it's here, but don't forget your weekends.
I'm Matt from APNIC. I agree with George. I don't see any way of getting out of the internet unless we start our own farms.
Okay, and this is Aftab, who has actually been running the ship. I'm just going to turn him around to the microphone. And yes, your view.
Yes, Aftab Siddiqui, Internet Society. Well, just to be honest, I have used 3.5 gigs of data on my mobile in the last 4 days. So it says a lot.
Yeah, look, when you're talking to someone who has a family with 2 teenagers, and a terabyte is nothing to us in a month. I think we're almost to the point where we're due to hand back to the mothership. But I think we're also, we have a very large cake. Are we going to do the cake now, or where are we up to?